uniqueness of language from a political philosophy point of view. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Let me open first by saying thank you to Monica for inviting us, for platforming us, for providing all the support that we have. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to come here and speak to the group. The second thing I want to say is actually to offer a couple of apologies. While we offer the topic on the uniqueness of language, this won't necessarily be the thing that we will focus on today. We will talk about this, and both David and myself has extensive things to say about the uniqueness of language within political philosophy, political theory, and ethics. But we're going to get there a bit differently than we thought originally. The other apology is I'm not a native speaker of English, so I'm gonna be a bit messy with my language. Please forgive me. And I'm also not a very confident speaker of French, which means that I will not be able to carry this through in French. So just bear with me, if that's if that's okay. Thank you. This is very kind. Okay, so. One of the interesting things, I think, for both David and myself about this group is that this group brings together people who work in not just in different fields, but also in different professional roles that has to do with the management of linguistic diversity. And so this gives an opportunity to have very interesting conversation and insights into how other people in other places with other lenses look at the management of linguistic diversity. So we actually thought that because we are the kind of two only political philosophers in the group, we thought it would be interesting to come here today and give a bit of a more extensive overview of what does it mean to think about language in political philosophy through normative ethics. And this is the thing that we will attempt to do here today. So we will speak a bit about the uniqueness of language and how it connects or is juxtaposed with other dimensions of human diversity, as the abstract says. But you'll see. We'll get there. The first thing I want to do, or the first thing I think would be useful, is to give you kind of a more general introduction as to how language is viewed in political ethics. And instead of me trying to mumble something, I think David just published actually a very, very interesting special issue, which is also coming out in the book. It's dedicated to it's a symposium that comes out in response or that engages with the book by Philippe Van Paris, Linguistic Justice for Europe and for the World, which is to date the only monograph, interestingly enough, that people who work in political philosophy of language have. So naturally, it sparks a lot of interest. And if you look at the book or the special issue, you'll find a lot of very interesting and sometimes very conflictual accounts of what is language, what is ethics, how the two things work or should work together. Are there different types of diversity management in language? Are there some worse ways and better ways? Having just read the special issues a couple of weeks ago, I would like fully recommend it. So I think we'll have David first to give us an overview, and then we'll just pick up on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica, for organizing this. We put together this book on Philippe Van Paris's monograph because, as Yael said, it's the only one that is dedicated to linguistic justice. There is another one that was published pretty much at the same time that is also entitled Linguistic Justice by Jacqueline Maubré, but it has very little to do with linguistic justice. So it has more to do with what the justice system is doing in relation to conflicts of languages and language diversity. But there is not really a proposition for a theory of linguistic justice per se. So Philippe is the only one to date that have this complete proposition regarding linguistic justice. And of course, there are a lot of people that are not satisfied completely with this book for obvious reasons. the linguistic justice debate emerged from basically two huge debates. So the first one was the debate between liberals and communitarians. So liberals presented this idea of the individual that is totally separated from his culture, his language, his values, his norms, etc. And he's able to make rational choices regarding how he wants to live his life. Communitarians like Charles Taylor or Michael Sandel challenged this view of the individual, saying we are never in this type of ideal, totally separated situation. We are always determined or at least colored by a very specific context, cultural context and linguistic context, and we have to stop thinking about the individual in those terms. So we have to give a little more credit to the idea of cultural and linguistic identity and stop considering it as something like an accident that comes after the creation of a rational individual. So many people working in the domain of linguistic justice or language policies come from this debate and arrived on the question of language, as a secondary interest after cultural diversity and cultural policies. The second big debate where people working on these topics come from is the one between nationalism and cosmopolitanism. So the idea of should we have cultural identity that has the same borders as a state, or should we try to recognize and promote different cultural differences and linguistic differences on a given territory, and by granting equal rights and guaranteeing equal treatment to every people on a given territory. So this is basically where the debate on linguistic justice comes from. There is one very peculiar aspect with language in this debate. It's that one solution that was favored by many liberals was to just have something, they call it politics of indifference, or a state blind to cultural differences or to religious differences and stuff. You cannot do that with languages. So of course the state can stay away from any religious question and try to stay away from any cultural question. It's hard when it comes to establishing a calendar with official holidays. Thank you. But with languages, you have to use one or the other to interact with the population, and there is no way you can say we are, neutral in terms of languages. You'll have to make choices. So this is one very interesting aspect of languages when it comes to theorizing about it, because the obvious, easy answer and solution for liberals wasn't applicable to languages. So, facing this challenge and realizing that there is no way we can just decide to abstain from intervening, we have to choose what kind of intervention is legitimate for the state and what kind of engagement we'll prioritize in different contexts. So two principles emerged as favored by those philosophers and theorists. The first one is equal treatment of every or some language groups on a territory. So what we have in Canada, what they have in Switzerland, we look at what we have in terms of linguistic groups, and we try to accommodate and recognize and grant equal treatment for every group on the territory. This can be done in two ways. The first way is by granting a territory to each language group, making sure that they are, as Philip von Paris would say, a queen, making sure that the language is a queen on this territory, so it is dominant and it is the only language spoken in institutions and in interactions with the population. Or we can do it by the personality model or personality principle, making sure that every individual, wherever he goes, can use whatever languages he prefers to interact with the institutions. So this is for the equal treatment of every language. The other principle that is used and preferred by some philosophers is the convergence towards one shared language. So people like Brian Barry, Samuel Huntington, Thomas Poge, were more inclined to see the benefits of one shared language for a community and try maybe not put pressure on linguistic diversity, but at least not promote it or to recognize some value in this diversity. The choice of principle that people choose usually is tightly related to the value that people see in languages. So there are three types of values that people see in languages. The first one is intrinsic value. So for some people, languages have value in themselves. So whether or not they are spoken, whether or not their speakers want to maintain them, we should try to invest time, money, and energy in at least preserving what's left of those languages because they are valuable in themselves. So they have an intrinsic value. We can think of Denise Réon, who sees languages as human creations. So as human creations, we should look at languages as we look at to art or to architecture or whatever. And we have something like a moral duty to protect those languages because they have value in themselves. We can come back on that. I'm convinced about that way of arguing. But the second type of value is identity values. So languages should be protected, promoted, and individuals should be guaranteed an access to or a right to speak their language for identity reasons. So we can think of different types of argument related to identity. The first one is the famous argument from Kimlicka saying that languages give us access to a culture, and our culture is where we can find the choices available to us. So liberals are very keen on arguing on the basis of the importance of autonomy, of individual autonomy. Well, Kimlicka argues autonomy is not something that you can exercise in a void. You need some specific options that are offered to you, and those options will be offered by your cultural context. And the only way you can get access to this cultural context is through your language. So therefore, we have to protect every language associated with the societal culture in order to make sure that individuals can exercise their autonomy. The second type of identity argument is based on dignity or self-respect. So the idea is quite simple. People value their own language. It's an important part of their identity, and they feel degraded or they feel that their dignity is under attack when somebody either treats their language as degenerate or unworthy of learning or whatever, or when the institutions are acting in a way that does not recognize their linguistic community as valuable as other linguistic communities. So this is for the identity value of languages. A lot of people refuse to go that way, saying that the states should not try to identify what people think is valuable for their identity. We should only look at non-identity justifications or non-identity reasons to promote, protect, or try to influence linguistic decisions. So the non-identity value of languages usually comes in three different arguments. The first one is efficiency. So there is a terrible loss of money in linguistic diversity. So every time we have to translate, every hour I spent learning English in order to be able to present to you, if my parent had decided not to teach me French but to teach me English when I was young, then all those costs would have been avoided, and translation and all that time that I'm spending when I'm writing papers in English that take me 4 times as much time as when I write in French. So efficiency is a major preoccupation. So linguistic diversity is something like what they call in economics transaction costs. So every time you have a possibility of exchange between two people, if they don't speak the same language, there are costs that could be avoided by sharing the same language. The second one is democracy. So going back to John Stuart Mill, who said there is democracy is next to impossible in a community that doesn't share a language. So the idea that we cannot participate as efficiently in a democratic debate if all people involved in this debate do not share the same language. It will necessarily create some sub-arena where very specific questions will be discussed, and those questions and the consensus on those in those arenas won't be available to people outside of this arena due to linguistic diversity. The last one, maybe the most intuitive one, is the question of equality of opportunity. And this is very relevant in states where you have a welfare state. Because, of course, we cannot expect that members of minority language communities will have the same opportunities and the same access to meaningful jobs, to high status positions, etc., as members of majority languages. So it creates unequal opportunities available to speakers of different communities. And the question is, how should we react to that? So is it compensated by the identity value of languages, or is it just a problem that the state has to deal with? So the main question is, do the state and the majority have to pay for, have to compensate the minority for those, inferior opportunities that they have access to? Or is it legitimate to consider that it's a choice that they made and that they should deal with the consequences that come with, speaking a minority language? So this is basically, a very fast and very imperfect overview of the debate on linguistic justice. And I concentrated mainly on linguistic justice because that's mainly what people are doing right now when they speak of, language policies from a normative point. So now, react.
So how should I start that? This was very useful in helping or kind of setting the stage for us to just to explain to you how and where the debate is situated right now. So if you work in political philosophy of language, but not just language, if you work in political philosophy and gender and the environment and war, political philosophy, and any other domain of human activity, most of the people who would do any kind of normative work will try to understand what it means in terms of justice. So people who were interested in normative issues in gender will work, for example, on gender justice. People who work on education and moral philosophy and political philosophy will work on justice in education. Same again with environmental justice and justice in war. There's unfortunately a flourishing branch of applied philosophy about the ethics of war. And in the same way, there's a bunch of theorists who think about normative issues in language in terms of linguistic justice. So I will start by saying that I think linguistic justice is a hugely important topic because I think many of the people in this room probably come from a context, whether regional or national or even personal context, where issues of linguistic justice are just very, very important. It's something that relates to the political history of where they come from. I mean, this is Canada, and I'm Israeli, and I think every one of us has in their own biography an acquaintance with a situation where there was some kind of power struggle between different languages. So I will start by saying that I think linguistic justice is a hugely important topic. But then I will also say that I think that committing the entirety of moral philosophy of language to that of justice, I think is a big mistake. And it's a bit of an unfortunate analogy, but think, for example, about people who go on like a fad diet, right? So you want to lose weight, and then you go on like a cabbage diet. Cabbage is a great vegetable, but if all you eat is cabbage, things can become very unpleasant at some point. And let me explain why I think that. And I will. Sorry for moving around. It just helps me think. Maybe I'm a bit like a fish. I need to move around just to feel I know where I am. Linguistic justice begins often with the question, what language should our institutions adopt? So we have a society have institutions, our courts, our schooling systems, our parliaments, what language should they adopt? Should this be just one official language? Should we accommodate minority languages? What should we do about immigrants, right? About languages that aren't local, but the more immigrants we have, the more we need to think about what we're doing with people who come and speak languages that do not necessarily have a political claim. And again, as I say, I think this is hugely important, but I think it misses out on a really important point, that language is something that people themselves view as something that isn't just an institutional thing. Language is something that stands at the basis of people relationability when people interact with one another, not necessarily as citizens, not necessarily as consumers of government services, not necessarily as students, but just as people. And I think that the emphasis that people who work on linguistic justice put, again, on justice and on institutions, misses out on the point that people who live in multilingual societies run into language barriers, not just with institutions, but with one another. And when this happens, there's always a question, what should I do? What is not the right thing to do? What is the good thing to do? If I meet someone who doesn't speak my language, who isn't the official language, and he needs my help. If I have a theory of linguistic justice that say, well, this is our territory, and here we only speak the official language, and if you don't speak it, well, very bad. I will not interact with you. I will not help you because for my moral perspective, you have to speak the language of the territory. And I think if you run into a kind of situation where not just a police officer, for example, refuses to help someone because they can't speak this person's language, but within civil society, for example, when we come to the point where language barriers either stop citizens or individuals from interacting from one another in a way that has nothing to do with institutions, but it has a lot to do with being a good person. Someone is lost and they need your help to find their way. Will you help them, or is the language of the territory so important to you that you're just going to say, well, it has to be in French or I'm not going to help you? For me, the overemphasis on justice, on the vocabulary of justice, or justice as a concept, is that it misses the point that human moral relationality, how people interact with one another, encompasses much more than just justice. There's care, there's friendship, there's hope, there's cooperation. And I think when we ditch all these very rich ways in which people interact with one another, or even expect to, interact with one another, then what we're losing, we might be gaining a wonderful theory of linguistic justice, but I think we're losing the human dimension of linguistic interaction. Because there's a point where people meet one another and they need help, or they're scared, and I think for them to be faced with an attitude that say, well, this is territory X, and here we speak X-ish, and this is a theory of justice. I think this doesn't just. It's something that started out maybe with a good idea or with good intentions, but it ended up generating moral harms rather than helping to create kind of a more moral society. So my first question to you, I guess, is, first of all, whether you agree, and second, what do you make of that? Like, do you think that political philosophy of language has more to offer than kind of liberal proceduralism, whereby we build institutions together, but everything that has to do about interaction between individuals as opposed to interaction between individuals and institutions has some kind of a place or space in this kind of topic?
Yeah. I agree that there is more to linguistic policy and linguistic morality than what people are doing in linguistic justice. However, I disagree with you in the sense that I think that linguistic justice is the building block on which everything else will be built. I think that we cannot expect, interlinguistic friendship, interlinguistic, cooperation, really, as warm as we can find, inside one linguistic community, unless people feel like there is something like linguistic justice, unless they feel at least recognized on a par with these other people they are trying to become friend with or cooperate with or have hope for the future with them. And so I think that of course it's very basic. Of course it's the minimum, but I think that why justice is so important is that you can expect it from people who really don't care about the others. Even if I care about nobody in a room, I will still apply some very minimal norms of, respect for their property, respect for their, physical integrity, respect for a bunch of things. I won't insult them, unless good reason. No, I won't insult them. There are a bunch of behavior that I will consider off limit for obvious reasons, because it would be unjust for me to act in those ways. However, once there is this just, when we establish the limits that a just behavior should not cross, then of course many more things become possible, and we can become friends. And of course, once you cross this line of intimité. Justice is not relevant anymore. So, if I give you a gift worth $40 for your birthday and you give me a gift worth $37, I won't treat it as if, you didn't give me the right change or whatever. It's something else that just happened. And so, of course, justice becomes totally irrelevant in some cases where, you have friends speaking to each other. So you have, an Anglophone an Anglophone friend who can speak French, but who's more comfortable in English around the table, and he speaks English, and everybody agrees. If he was, a state representative, things would be different. But of course, I'm not applying the standards of justice the same way with, a representative from the state and to an individual. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you mentioned, that cup that you mentioned also in the paper, maybe I'll present the whole thing. Philippe Van Parijs in a book says what threatens languages right now is not so much the pressure from big languages on small languages. The real threat comes from the inside. The real threat comes from the fact that minority speakers learn second languages. This second languages is usually a higher status language, and it gives them access to that dominant or larger community. So what happens is that the nicer people are to each other, the meaner the languages will be with each other, because every time these people will meet, every time a member of the minority and a member of the majority will meet, systematically they will speak the dominant language. For obvious reasons, because members of the dominant language don't learn a second language, or if they do, they'll learn a higher status one. They won't go down, unless it's required to get a job in the federal institutions or something. But they won't learn a dominated or a weaker language. So his idea was to propose restrictions that the state should make it mandatory to speak minority languages in institutions and in some social contexts. So for example, if you are a clerk in a bank, well, you should be required to speak only, for example, French in Quebec or English elsewhere, or Flemish in the Flemish part of Belgium, in order to protect and stop this war of languages against each other. So if each individual that knows a dominant language as a second language refrain from using it in some context, it would protect the minority language, and it would force, or at least incentivize dominant speakers to learn at least some basic skills in this language. So his idea was that we should ask the state to put in place some laws and some restrictions in order to avoid people having to look mean to each other. Because if there is no law in place and I'm a clerk and I just say, well, I'm not going to help you because because you don't talk to me in French, even though I could, because I understand what you're saying, but I won't help you because you're not speaking English to me. Of course, nobody wants to be that guy. Nobody wants to be a jerk like that, and you can be as convinced about, the importance for linguistic preservation as you want. Nobody wants to be that person. And so Philippe André said, well, at least if we have, laws in place, we can refer to the laws and not, look as a jerk. And so the problem is, of course, aren't we forgetting some kind of minimal ethics in our, relationships with others and putting way too much emphasis on linguistic justice? And the answer is no, of course, because nobody would ever argue, and Philip would be the first to recognize that, nobody would argue that linguistic justice is, the thing, and then you have more, mundane, less important thing like, physical integrity and security and equality, economic equality or whatever. The idea is that it is part of the rights and duties that we have. Of course, there are a bunch of others. We still have a duty to assist people in danger or, that are in a bad situation. This does not disappear once we adopt, linguistic justice norms or linguistic justice related duties. However, it becomes part of all those duties. It becomes something that we have in mind, that when we interact with some people in some ways, maybe we are not really seeing the difference from an individual point of view. Speaking in French or in English, if you're a clerk at a bank, doesn't really change a lot of your, doesn't reduce your well-being or doesn't change your day much. But if everybody starts doing it, of course, then it becomes really easy and very easily accessible for people not speaking French to, I'm speaking if I was correct, to have access to a bunch of services and institutions and everything. And then, of course, it reduces the power, the status, and the willingness for people to learn that language. So that's what Philippe André had in mind when he discussed that. And so I think it makes sense to consider that we have something like a moral duty to ourselves and to our community to at least have those kind of things in mind and to weigh, the benefits and costs of some behavior on the individual level and the benefits and costs of those same behavior on the collective level. So if everyone starts speaking indiscriminately French or English, then, why would anyone learn French except if they want to go, way back in the country where, most people won't be as fluent in English. So to use an analogy, we established property. So if I steal someone's property, it's unjust. But of course, this doesn't, put any pressure on me not to give money out of charity to people who are in need or to, people who deserve it in some way. So there is absolutely no problem in having competing claims or competing duties in different contexts. We have them all the time. So we are facing, duties and conflict in many situations, and this is just another layer that we add that adds, duties of justice in the linguistic domain to a bunch of other duties that we already have. So I don't know.
It's interesting as you were speaking. One of the thoughts that ran through my head was that there's something a bit too convenient, I think, about saying, well, there's the laws, the codified laws, and there, you can also be like a good person in your own time and exercise your autonomy however you see fit and support whichever charity you want. And the reason I bring this up is because so much of the debate that takes place at the moment in multicultural theory is about solidarity. And the thing I'm asking myself, so if officially the kind of combination of political culture and linguistic culture that you have in a certain society, if it becomes the kind of culture whereby human benevolence is seen as a problem, right? The meaner, the friendlier the languages, the friendlier the people, the meaner the languages. I don't think it stops there. I think it trickles down. I think people look to the laws of the societies in which they live, and they say, well, maybe this is something we can also try to follow in our private life as private citizens. So I guess what I am worried about is that, let's take an easy example, right? Someone who's an officer of the law, or someone who works in hospital, and the patients arrive, and the patient doesn't the French isn't very good, and you're sick, so you're very you can't express yourself very well the way that I can't express myself very well right now because I'm very nervous, and this affects how the physician is doing their job. But then when the physician goes home, he doesn't take off his like official rules clothes and then he's putting on his nice social solidaristic clothes. I think there's something about the ways in which, again, political and linguistic cultures encourage a certain sense of civic relationship. And when we have a linguistic justice theory that says that it's okay to be nasty, and Philip is using these words, so I think nasty, coercive. I have no problem with coercive. We're going to talk about power later and the ways in which sometimes you have to use power. It's legitimate. It's a good reason for doing that. But I worry about the fact that we have kind of an institutional setup that kind of tells people it's okay to be nasty in certain places, and then they go home. And as private people, they kind of continue this attitude. And I think if there's anything that could be said about multilingual society, multicultural societies, is that benevolence, civic benevolence, isn't necessarily something that exists there in abundance, right? Things like solidarity and trust. It's a whole lot of civic relationship that has to be built very slowly, very carefully. And I guess I'm just a bit worried that when we're putting all our chips on justice, and especially on theories of justice, where kind of, in a sense, allows you to be a linguistic jerk, it doesn't end there. And I think there's some bad news there for civic society and civic interaction. I think we kind of probably move forward, I guess. The second question I had for you, following on the piece, which I think maybe if people in the room want to have a copy, maybe they can email us and we can send you this piece. Just a really nice overview of where the discussion is right now. Is about.
Maybe people have questions also, since we are turning to another.
Yeah, we're going to another question, so maybe.
Carson, while I've worked I find your both your presentations fascinating. And it's an opportunity for someone like me who works in the federal government and we grapple with some of these issues every day to kind of see boxes and categories, and it allows me to kind of find my way when reality can be really quite messy. But I have a question. Before I get to the question, just very briefly, I found myself sympathizing with both of you. And the reason is, in the federal government, we have rules which look like linguistic justice. In some ways, they're aspirational. In some contexts, they are reality. In other contexts, we're far from that actual aspirational goal. So you have situations where people have rights, and these rights are not always respected. And so what do? They're nice people. They're good people. So if you are not supervised in your preferred language, if you attend meetings time and time again, the meeting, there's not really an encouragement to speak, let's say, French in the meeting. You can be the good person. You say, I'm being nice, and because these are your friends, your colleagues, your supervisor, and everything. But at some point, you feel, well, it grates on you, and then you sort of appeal to that linguistic justice element. You have to. I mean, it's important that the nicety doesn't necessarily get you to the situation where you are, in a sense, not the victim of a personal offense by someone in the room, but some systemic shortcoming, let's call it, and then the linguistic justice provides you this anchor. But if you always made appeal to, every time you appeal to the linguistic justice argument, you wouldn't have any friends, you know. And so the question I have for you is, as far as I can see, there's never this sort of 0 hour where we sit down and we say, okay, is it territoriality or personality principle? You know, how do we, we have sort of this moment where we can decide, the rules and define it all, and then we press start and, things kind of take off. So what can we do with your theories in terms of addressing, whether it's in government, whether it's here at the University of Ottawa, where I'm sure there are, language issues that bubble up, to find our way in this sort of messy reality, to kind of understand the evolution of practices, to understand the linguistic justice kind of theory that sits behind it, and then address it in a way where we look for incremental progress. We define that incremental progress. I mean, in government, we talk about maturity models. So we say we can't do everything, in 1 year. We need a little bit of time. But how do we assess whether we're on this sort of tangent of, benign neglect of rights that really grates on people, or whether we're really not where we should be, but we're kind of making progress? How do you have tools that help us assess progress or regression in those very specific contexts?
Well, building on what I said earlier, I think that as soon as linguistic communities feel like their language is being treated with dignity, that there is something like reciprocity between both language communities, then they will be much more willing to accept some debatable or questionable interactions in specific contexts, either at work or with I think that most people are usually well-intended. They are flexible. They don't they are willing to go out of their way to help and to. But I think that the problem that you referred to and that was really clear, and Philip refers to that, he says it's always the same people who are bowing down to the other language, and that's what becomes very irritating. Of course, you wouldn't mind helping someone who doesn't speak French, if they are tourists and they are visiting, but after 10 times that you're helping someone who lives in Montreal for 20 years and doesn't speak a word of French, not even to say bonjour and pourrez-vous m'aider. So it gets on you, and then it starts feeling like an unjust situation. You start feeling like it's not individual interactions. It's one group facing another group, and this is a representative of the other group. And there is an interesting book about that that I didn't plan on commenting, and I forgot the name, so I'll introduce it later. But his theory was, he said, many people think that the more mixing there are between two groups, the more accepted the other group will be from the first one, and he said that's true, as long as people interact as individuals. So if you have communities that are really, really mixed up, then that's okay. As soon as they segregate and they are interacting, both in their worlds and only interact in some instances or in some context, then the whole thing changes, because they are not seeing individuals when they are interacting. They are seeing members of the other group that is either putting pressure on them, that is taking jobs from them, that is whatever. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, because we've been pushing towards, mixity for a long time, but we didn't really look at that kind of, reality, and it seems like it's an important thing. Then for, what should we do now and in steps, I think that we have to put in place something that feels mostly just. Like that people would see as, mostly just, and that would suppress this, this threat to language minorities. Be them, indigenous people, or French in Quebec, or the Anglophone minority in Quebec, also feels sometimes too much pressure. The same with Francophone minority outside of Quebec. And if you suppress that, I think it will be much easier to, convince people to, for example, learn more English earlier in the process through elementary school. If they feel like French is protected and it's maybe not guaranteed, but it's the institutions are treating the community justly. And then, of course, everyone realizes and recognizes that English is a great thing, and that if you start learning it earlier, you won't be like me and make mistakes when you express yourself later on. But they are not willing to go that path because they feel like it's letting the wolf into the lambs. I don't know, Belgium, so that's bad. But that's why I say, linguistic justice is a building block. It's one thing that you have to do, and then you can build much more significant and much warmer relationships. But I don't think we can expect people to be ready to build those other forms.
So I actually want to pick up on something that David says, because David said that most people are happy to help and be helpful, and they're good people. I think, if anything, like the domain of language is where we see that people might be good, but people also have fears and insecurities, and they feel threatened. And within this very kind of distressed mental state, they still want to do the right thing or the good thing. And the right thing is not always the good thing. And that's a point that I thought was important to make in the paper. I guess there are two ways of looking at it, right? One is to understand the context where you are. Is this more about developing relationship, or is this more about, I guess, like a professional meeting? Sandel has this beautiful metaphor in Liberalism and the Limit of Justice, where he says that if you take a friend to a restaurant and every time he insists on paying the exact amount of what he consumed, you start to wonder at some point whether you've misunderstood your relationship. So I think, and I mean, I have this all the time. So I'm not very confident with my French, and I constantly have meetings with French people, and you try to understand like the purpose of the purpose of what is happening, and then what's going to be the best way of moving forward. I don't have anything in the way of a toolkit, and I think if anyone had anything in the way of a toolkit, I would be a little bit suspicious, because contextual factors play a big part. But I would say there's a very interesting book that comes from, actually just came out from Ian Shapiro, who's a philosopher, and he makes the point that with immigration, world is becoming a global world, and we increasingly finding ourselves independent of people whom we don't necessarily know. Partners who don't necessarily speak our language, immigrants from a country with which we're not familiar. And he said the best thing to do in this kind of context where mistrust is almost the norm is to be hopeful. Now, hopeful isn't like a cheesy something that you put on YouTube to, I don't know, to decorate some kind of a cheesy video. Hopeful, I say, is an adaptive rationality. It's everyone making a signal that they are willing to help toward achieving some kind of a common goal. So if you want to build, I don't know, a more linguistically just society, or we want to have a good business meeting when everyone feels both appreciated and recognized, but at the same time we also want to get, we want to get our goals. He said the kind of cooperation that underpins adaptive rationality is where everyone doing a little bit effort, and then I make a little bit effort, and then the other person says, well, if she's making the effort and she has something to lose, well, I'm going to make a bit of effort as well. So it doesn't give the kind of very clean moral solution to whether you should opt for the justice route or the being nice route. But I think it does give a way forward. What do we do when we're independent of people whose behavior we can't exactly pin down, or we just don't know exactly how to do things together with them? And I think this is the world in which we are kind of living, right? I've been twice immigrant now, so I know a lot about coming into a new society and trying to find my way in it. But I mean, look at what's happening in Europe, right? Or look at what's happening, I guess, everywhere. The kind of global world we're living right now is a world where you have this irreducible tension between linguistic difference. We're going to talk about diversity in a second. Linguistic diversity and interdependence. We're all interdependent on one another to achieve goals, to help, save something of the environment, to create better societies. And I think I'm worried that we can't do that if we only care about institutions. But I think we need to care about people meeting and interacting with other people as well. I'm not saying that linguistic justice is useless. I think it's hugely important. But I will say that if you only eat cabbage as a vegetable, you can end up with some unpleasantness.
Yeah, we can start with rice and add other things and keeping the rice. Cabbage, it's harder to do. But I have a question to bounce back on what you were saying. So, hope is something that you can build a lot on, but as you said, you need to get signals from other people that, they are willing to go in the same direction.
Yeah.
But at what point can you consider that people have legitimate reasons to believe that the others are not willing to go into the direction that they would like them to go? And on that point, I think that that's where we are at in terms of linguistic interactions in many countries, where the dominant group is not interested to, keep playing the game that they used to play due to a bunch of reasons. English as a lingua franca, more mobility, more demand for those dominant languages on the international market, etc. And so I like the idea of, thinking that we start from scratch and that we build something, that is a little more virtuous than simply, normative and this, you have to do this, you can't do that. And of course, that's not the best way to establish a warm relationship. However, I don't think that the present situation would be better if we suppressed some of those norms. I think that, the fate of many minority communities would be just harsher. And so on that point, could it be considered that, members of the minority languages got a lot of signals from members of the majorities that they are not willing to do much to, keep up the good relationship and to maintain, the respect for their languages. And, there are less and less people learning French. In Quebec, the proportion of bilingual people is more and more in the French community. How can we interpret that, and how can we say, yeah, but we have to, take out and suppress some of those norms, and people will start hugging each other instead of, applying their rule book or whatever? Maybe it's a hard question.
No, not at all. If anything, I think there's something very, I think this goes back to something Karsten was saying, there's something very comfortable about norms and about laws, because when you have something written that obliges you, no matter what you think, no matter what your moral position is, you don't have to be anxious, because someone is telling what you do, and you're expected to follow it. There's something very convenient about it. You don't have to struggle for an outcome, because that outcome is, in a sense, already guaranteed. There's an interesting book by Michael Frieden about political thinking, and he's saying that the interesting thing about politics is that politics is an open-ended game, and this is why so much of the vocabulary of politics is actually about finality. It's about elections, it's about decisions, it's about majority. It's about anything that can kind of anchor us into a point and say, okay, well, this is how we agree, this is what we're going to do. So I don't want to dismiss laws. I don't want to dismiss norms. I think norms are hugely important, and I'm not saying that norms shouldn't be codified in legislation. I'm just a bit, I guess, what I am worried about is that the kind of impersonal norms are becoming the thing that we have in mind when we meet someone who doesn't necessarily follow our linguistic expectations, and we're thinking, well, what are we going to do about this strange bird? Okay, well, there's a legislation that says that it's okay to be nasty. It's okay, we can be nasty.
Is this really how you think on other type of questions? Do you really approach people thinking, what are my rights and duties by approaching this person? And why would it change once we have legislation that has to do with languages? In some cases it's obvious. We are not allowed to help someone who's robbing a bank or whatever. That's obvious. If someone is, a fugitive, those kind of things will come to our mind. Should I do the right thing? He's a good guy, but at the same time he's a fugitive, so that's a bit weird. But in usual context, we don't think in those terms. It's just there to, like orient our behaviors, but we don't think it wouldn't prevent me from, approaching someone with very, warm feelings or whatever. And you often take, very mundane context, when I think that what people like Peled Robichaud have in mind is more, very either institutional or, business-oriented cases. Like, can we tolerate that someone is hired as the CEO of a business and only speaks English in Quebec? Or should it make it mandatory that at least, meetings are held in French in order not to discriminate and, hurt the potential and the capacity of unilingual francophones, for example, to progress in that company? So this is more those kind of cases that they have in mind than, if you're walking in a park and someone asks, hey, where can I get some papa papa, or I don't know papa papa in English either. I don't know why I would know. Cotton candy? Yeah. So, of course you will help that person. But I think it's not as big a deal in terms of, an obstacle to the creation of warm relationships as you presented to me.
I think, so it's interesting that you're bringing up Felipe and economics, because I didn't grow up in economics, so I don't have the kind of like epistemic baggage that often goes with economic theory and the kind of assumption you make about human nature and the kind of relationship that people develop. I should probably, so it won't seem that we're actually fighting. I mean, I think your we is kind of worrying me a bit, because so in political philosophy, a lot of it is built on people testing moral intuition and say, well, what would the reasonable person do? Reasonable person is often how the political philosophers think about themselves, and they kind of generalize it to the general population. I won't talk about Quebec because there are slight complexities there, and I want to kind of leave this a bit out of the situation. I think not everyone might be as kind as you are. I've seen enough. This is Israel, you have to speak Hebrew here. In Israel, I've seen enough. This in England, you can't speak Arabic here. It might be that not everyone opt to go this route. And I think if you're starting up with a perception of human nature that is, that people are not just autonomous and rational, but confident, right? That they don't easily give in to kind of insecurities they have about relationship, or they don't necessarily give in to fears, for example, then of course they would be, I'm not saying people are malevolent, but I think the kind of language conflicts that sometimes happen, and I think the kind of immigration pattern that we currently see is only going to exacerbate that. It often brings out, even among good people, some very, very uncomfortable feelings. It brings out fears. It brings up anxiety. It's not because these people are bad people, but because this is what happens when you have an age of social transformations. People are not so confident about who they are and where they live and who is this new person who comes in and what is your duty towards them. And I think this is the kind of ground where even good people, right? People who don't say to their employers, no, you can't. This is Quebec. You can't speak Spanish even in your like cigarette break, because this is Quebec and this is French-speaking institution. I think I'm worried, I guess, about the kind of psychological or moral psychological kind of blind spot that some political philosophy has, because it's so focused on people who, in a sense, they don't have a history, they don't have tensions, they don't have anxieties, they don't live in conflict, which undermines how they feel and who they are and what is their role and purpose in the world. And I'm a bit worried about that. You're starting with a conception of human nature that is so, in a sense, so unrealistic, or not unrealistic, but I think it doesn't necessarily correspond to how people, the political agency of many people. I think democratic theory as a whole, I think, it doesn't acknowledge us, I think, because it's so focused on again this kind of beautiful neat rationality of justice that happens in a very neat world there, that I think it forgets that the world of politics in multicultural societies it can be very painful, even if you're part of the majority. It's painful, it's uncertain. It can bring out a lot of things in you that you wouldn't necessarily be happy about. And I think you need to have a lot of confidence to kind of avoid that, and to generalize from your own confidence into a huge political demos at an age of such sweeping transformations. I just worry there might be some methodological bias there. And I don't know if this is because of the political philosophy or because of the kind of assumptions that economic theory starts with. But I think so the way I think about it is, if you compare, for example, like American and British movies about multiculturalism, right? So like American movies would be something like My Greek Weddings, right? So we have people coming from different, but it basically follows the plot of Shrek, right? Two very different people, then there's some conflict, but everyone is just getting married, and there's a big celebration and a nice dinner. But if you look at like British movies about multiculturalism, there's a lot less celebration and a lot more kind of domestic violence, because it undermines people's understanding of who they are and what is this world that they have to operate in. And language, I think, is unique in a sense that it's when we go back to the abstract that we proposed, because it's not just a symbol; it's also how you reflect on who you are and how you work in the world. So I think I'm a bit worried that the current linguistic justice theories that we have, and many good people doing great work, it's so clean, in a sense. It's really clean. It's really neat. It's lovely. I just think it doesn't correspond to how people act in the world as political agents, as linguistic agents. But I might be overthinking this.
No. Well, I think that it's important to keep separated descriptive theories and normatives. And there is nowhere, in some, but in people doing, very procedural, normative linguistic justice, their idea is not to offer an adequate description of how people value their languages or how people interact with each other. It's to put in place the rule of the game, and then you can play that game for different reasons, and there can be different payoffs, and you can play with different people that you like or that you don't like, and things can happen on this during the game. But it's still the rules of the game, and the rules are only there, not to promote some kind of, relationship or feeling of membership to a community or whatever. It's only there to make sure that nobody gets screwed during the game. And then after that, it's up to the players to develop, things if the context is right, if they have something in common, if whatever. And so I think that it's the wrong way to look at linguistic justice, to see that they are not interested in those kind of relationships. It's not that they are not interested in those kind of relationships. It's just that there is so many things to do that we have to start somewhere. And I think that the most important place to start is to put in place rules that will make sure that nobody is really disadvantaged by his situation. And then, we can, and I think that's the main disagreement that we have. You think that, putting in place rules of justice and norms of justice will prohibit the creation of, warmer feelings and more, interested relationship. And I think that this is totally the opposite. I think that this is what makes those relationships most likely. I think that once you are not afraid of being always on the losing end in interaction with people from the other linguistic community, you'll be all that more likely to interact with them and to work in a bilingual context and to whatever. When you mentioned, I'm not sure if it comes from the economic perspective or whatever. Absolutely not. And this is even more important to make the distinction between descriptive and normative. So what economist does, or what libertarian does, because the reason why I use economics a lot is that it allows you to travel light. And so you only talk about interest, about very concrete interest, and you are not always stuck with people like Brian Barry, late Brian Barry, or Kukatas, or people like that saying, "Oh, I don't care about my language. It has no identity value for me." And then you say, well, I think that's not possible, but I have to deal with that argument now. So when you build from the economic framework, it allows you to say, let's ignore this identity thing. Let's just look at costs and benefits. Of course, we're not saying that people only look at their languages through a cost and benefits analysis. But if you can convince someone that doesn't believe in the identity value of language, that only on the basis of costs and benefits, you should adopt some behaviors and you should, prohibit from adopting some behaviors, then of course it will be all that more, you just reach people that are not reachable through the usual discourse of Kimlicka and Van Parijs, of dignity, of the importance of identity, of autonomy through languages, of stuff like that. And the reason why I think that it's not the problem that you see in there is that nobody would argue that that's the end of the story. Nobody would argue that people just look at costs and benefits and that they will evaluate, well, should I get it? Because some economists say that. They say, well, if you choose to marry someone, you'll make the pros and cons, and if the pros, are, better, then you'll marry her. And, that's not how we approach life. Of course, it's a way to look at life. That's not usually how we approach life. However, it's a good way to make sense of things that are messy. So in many contexts, we are very confused about what we should do, what we shouldn't do. Is it okay for me to do that, etc. If we can come up with just an analysis of costs and benefits and of who bears those costs, it's one way to present things that after that, we can pile up a bunch of other layers that will be much more complicated. But at least it gives a justification. So if, for example, I plan on adopting a behavior that will impose costs on Karsten, and I'm wondering if it's okay or not, at least knowing that it's costs that I'm imposing on them, it's just costs. It gives me at least a justification to prohibit from adopting this behavior. Of course, if we're a good friend, I can think, well, he'll find that funny that I, pour, I don't know, whipped cream in his office or whatever, but it still costs, it's still pure costs. So if we're a good friend, I can go above that. But when you are in an unknown relationship with people, which is usually what we have with, our co-citizens, I know nobody here on the level of anxiety, fears, what they like, what they dislike, things like that. So I have to adopt something like a general abstract behavior that is that is determined by what justice tells me that is acceptable and what etiquette tells me that is acceptable, and a bunch of norms. But of course I won't act in a way that will protect the anxiety of some people, because I have no idea of those kind of things. And it's only through interaction that we can get to this kind of knowledge of someone. And I think that this level of knowing someone will be promoted by putting in place just policies, just norms.
We have like 4 minutes.
Yeah.
It's
We go to power.
see the importance of rules. Right?
Yes.
But it's reassuring. The rules have important psychological role. They take
But we have 4 minutes left.
they take off anxiety.
Oui, justement, vous allez parler de pouvoir parce que alors qu'il a affiché professeur à la faculté de jazz, c'est s'envoyer ici. Travailler avec ces théories-là, mentalistes, etc. Ça fait longtemps que je regarde ça. Je pense que avoir votre opinion là-dessus, là, je ne suis pas sûr de ce que j'avance. Plus je regarde ça, plus je trouve que la notion de justice n'a rien à voir avec la que tout le débat lui-même est faussé à sa base. On avait commencé en disant que c'est un débat extrêmement important. J'aimerais revenir au point de départ. Moi, je dis que ce n'est pas important. Ce qui est important, c'est le pouvoir et comment le réguler. Et c'est comme ça que les citoyens vont prendre leurs décisions, que les États vont prendre leurs décisions. La notion de justice n'a rien à voir avec la politique linguistique. Faites le tour du monde. Regardez toutes les politiques linguistiques de tous les pays. C'est toujours des questions d'histoire et de pouvoir international. La minorité d'aujourd'hui devient la majorité de demain. Elle exerce un pouvoir, elle crée une nouvelle minorité, ça recommence. C'est déprimant comme constat. This is a bomb I'm throwing in the room. No, I don't think justice has anything to do with language.
It shouldn't have anything to do, or has anything.
It doesn't have anything.
And it shouldn't.
Well, should it or not, it doesn't.
No, but I mean, it's a very different question. Saying that, the language people talk and the policies that they have in terms of languages is not determined by justice is one thing. But should we aim towards more justice in the establishment of policies is another question. And so, that's another illustration of the descriptive and normative. So I think I would agree with you descriptively that justice has a very tiny role to play, maybe in some very particular cases like indigenous people. They get a little bit of help from the institutions on the basis of some kind of justice, but it's already so late that, power did already too much damage then. But from a normative point of view, I think that it's a good thing to try to, counter the power of some communities able to impose the costs of their linguistic choices on others. And so that's where, and I think that's mainly what theorists of linguistic justice are doing.
This is where I would challenge them.
Yeah?
C'est là que je voudrais les défier.
Pierre, ça va être débat 2.
Yeah.
Pierre Fouchet, David Robichaud.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The three of them.
What about the epistemology? Because what would be that ends in linear argumentation? What about that working thinking?
Yeah.
Connected.
Yeah.
Maybe there is some possibilities there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to make my mind around that kind of questions right now. I'm writing something on translation. And, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And, the lingua franca in science, English with everyone, pouring stuff in this whole, debate. It's a complicated question, I think, because I don't know if I understood your question correctly, but, I think that having many research projects working in silo one by the other in different languages, and then, sharing their results, produced a lot of goods that wouldn't have been possible if everyone had collaborated from the start.
Because there is no pure languages or pure qualities. They are all translingual and transcultural.
Yeah.
At the origin, right now, and always. So, to separate and to study just one fragment of the reality is always.
You talk about culture, and I'm not going there. Because of course, on that point, you're right. Of course, it's just a mix match of a bunch of influences and stuff. But still, I think that languages protect from some kind of, and I will use corruption, but not in the sense that something bad is coming in, but just it protects some kind of, way of looking at things, or it creates a debate that is local, that creates some concepts, that creates some distinctions, that provides a very specific look at one specific problem. And then, if others are doing the same, then we can compare, things, we can translate the concepts, something that is not possible when everyone is using the same language, especially when they are using it and it's their second language. Because basically, they mess up. They mess up the language. They propose, bad translations and loan words that have equivalent and equivocals, and so that's. I think that, linguistic diversity on this at this level has. I think the best situation is linguistic diversity and one lingua franca that allows for the best results, for the most relevant results to be shared. But it's still useful, I think, to have those local research projects where people, interact and don't try to speak the same language as all the others. You can come up with something very original, very useful, that is very specific to a particular context that wouldn't have been possible or interesting for, that worldwide research community or something.
Ça, c'est la théorie de la
There's a.
psychologie des langues.
Yeah.
C'est pas dans soi.
Ouais, non, je dirais pas, je dirais vraiment qu'elle est bonne tant qu'elle produit des bénéfices, en fait, sur ce point-là. Parce que vous avez raison, oui.
Parce que c'est des worldviews, c'est ça. C'est un worldview. La langue est le véhicule
Linguistic ecology.
sur le monde.
Ouais,
Et en ce sens-là, la diversité linguistique est bonne parce que ça te donne beaucoup de regards sur le monde.
ouais, mais moi, en fait, je n'irais même pas aussi loin que ça. C'est simplement les termes qu'on va créer pour parler d'une situation, par exemple, la situation linguistique nationale au Québec, par exemple. Les concepts qui ont été développés, utilisés, le regard à l'histoire, tout ça, n'est pas le même que ce qu'on va retrouver en Belgique ou ce qu'on va retrouver justement en Flandre ou peu importe. Donc, c'est pas de dire que c'était impossible pour un Flamand de voir la chose de la même façon, ce qui est un peu la prémisse là, de cette façon de voir-là, un peu